So for this next video, I'm going to go through the three hypotheses. I'll show you what the output looks like, but then I've also provided a summary of the output in a PowerPoint, so it's much more user-friendly. So as I said, we're going to be testing our hypotheses through correlations and t-tests. So if the first hypothesis, we think that people who are older and further along in their college careers will have more responsibilities and tasks and therefore report higher stress. So one way we can look at this using the perceived stress questionnaire, the undergraduate stress questionnaire, and then age, we can just look at the correlation between these variables. So with this, you can see, you'll notice that the triangle, the upper triangle is the same as the lower triangle of, this is called a correlation matrix, and that's because it's repetitive. You can see here that the undergraduate stress questionnaire correlates well with the perceived stress. That makes sense. Those that report more instances of stress in their lives also have a higher perception of stress, and you see that that's significant. P is less than 0.001. We have a sample size of 135. Now it's repetitive in that down here we see that the perceived stress is related to the undergraduate stress questionnaire, so it's the same. So in a correlation matrix, you only need to look at the top half. Along the diagonal, we can see that there's a perfect correlation, and that makes sense because these are the correlations of the variables to each other. So what do we see here? In terms of looking at age and perceived stress, it is not significant, so P is not less than 0.05. In terms of the undergraduate stress questionnaire, however, we do see that it's significant, that there's a negative correlation. That means as your age is higher, you report less stress, or you could say it another way. As you are reporting more stress, your age is lower. Now remember, correlation does not imply causation, so we can't say that age causes stress or stress causes age. These are just the patterns that are emerging. So this is actually, it contradicts our hypothesis. This would suggest that the younger individuals in our sample had more stress than the older individuals. So why would you think that is? What do you know about the demographics, what I described to you in the previous video, that might explain this opposite direction than what we would expect from our hypothesis? So I want to show you how when you see statistics, you need to be critical of how they approached it, because you can approach things from different ways and get different answers. So for example, if we look at the variable that I made, the dichotomized level, so it's comparing seniors to the rest of the group, and let's look at perceived stress in the undergraduate stress questionnaire and see if a similar pattern emerges. So this is a t-test. We're comparing means. You can see that our sophomores and juniors are 1, our seniors are 2. We have 102 sophomores and juniors, only 38 seniors. The average for the undergraduate stress questionnaire, we see about 19 stress items are identified for sophomores and juniors, and it's about 20 for seniors. Now look at the standard deviations. You see that we have more variance for seniors in terms of how much stress. And when we look down here, we can look at the t-test. This is degrees of freedoms, deals with our sample size, and it is not significant. So we do not see any kind of difference between seniors and non-seniors in terms of how much stress they're identifying. Now let's look at their perceived stress. And right off the bat, you can see that the means are very similar, the standard deviations are very similar, so you wouldn't expect a comparison of these means to show any significant difference. And in fact, look, this is a tiny t value, and it is non-significant. So by dichotomizing by class rank as a proxy for age, we're seeing that there's no difference. So then I want to show you one more way we can run this, and that's by doing the median split. So in this manner, we are comparing individuals who are less than 21 to those that are greater than 21 to see if there's any kind of stress. So you could think about those over 21, they may be more likely to have more responsibilities. They may have families, they may be married, have a full-time job, compared to those that are less than 21. So let's see what this comparison looks like in terms of perceived stress. And one thing you should notice is, look, the sample size is almost exactly the same, and you would expect that because it is a median split, and the median compares the two sides of the sample. So for those that are less than 21, the average for perceived stress is reported at about 39. It's also around 39 for those that are greater. So again, looking similar means, similar standard deviations, you wouldn't expect to see a significant t-test. And in fact, when you look at our t-value, it is non-significant. And when we look at our undergraduate stress questionnaire, we are seeing a slightly different pattern in that for those that are less than 21, they are reporting a greater number of stress events. And there's not only are those that are older than 21 reporting less, but there is more variability. And in fact, when we look at the t-value, it is non-significant, but this is what we often talk about in the field as trending towards significance. So we wouldn't interpret this as significant, but we would just sort of think about this and think, okay, well, maybe if we had a bigger sample size, maybe if we replicated this, this could become significant. Maybe there is something there and it's just not coming up because of our sample. So that gives you all the information that you need for hypothesis 1. So it was not supported, and in fact, we demonstrated something going on in the opposite direction than how the hypothesis was worded. So next, let's move on to hypothesis 2. We think that people who are more optimistic, who use humor more, will have lower perceived stress and better coping. So what I did is broke this up into our passive coping mechanisms that are not as effective as our active coping mechanisms. So let's see if there's any difference. So we have perceived stress, we have coping, and then the different ways of coping. So, oh, this is, I'm sorry, humor coping. So let's run that. Now this looks like a hot mess and can be very confusing. So what I want you to focus on is just the first line, because that's all the variables that we need. We are comparing perceived stress to humor. And it is significant. It's a negative relation, so people who use more humor are reporting less perceived stress, or people who are reporting greater perceived stress are reporting less humor. In terms of ways of coping, escape avoidance, people who report high perceived stress seem to use this coping mechanism quite a bit. We're also seeing accepting responsibility seems to be used quite a bit. You can see these asterisks that shows the significance level. Down here, it provides you what that means. However, there's not a significant relationship between perceived stress and self-controlling or distancing. So now let's look at the active ways of coping. And when we run that, we see that, well, look, that's exactly the same as it should be, right? But there is not a relationship for perceived stress and seeking social support, planful problem solving, or positive reappraisal. These are all really good coping strategies. We do see that those take more confrontive coping. I'm sorry, that's a typo. Confrontive coping do report higher perceived stress, and maybe that's because those who have more going on, they perceive stress. If they're perceiving it accurately, they are having to confront the stress and come up with a plan. So that gives you all the information that you'll need for hypothesis 2. In terms of humor and coping, now let's look at optimism and coping. And again, need to quickly fix this so that we I think it's easier to look at the active ways of coping separately. So I just showed you why syntax is so great, because you can make really quick changes. So now the LOT, that's optimism. We're going to look at perceived stress optimism, the passive coping mechanisms, and then the active coping mechanisms. So what's going on here? In terms of optimism, of course, we only need to look at this top row. We're seeing that those who are more optimistic report lower perceived stress. There's a negative relationship, or you could say those who report higher perceived stress are less optimistic. In terms of these passive coping approaches, we see that perceived stress, well, we noticed that before. These are repeats from the last matrices. So you really are just interested right here in this variable. Let's see, there is a relationship, if we went down, from distancing and optimism. So those that are more likely to be optimistic are more likely to report using distancing coping, and that's interesting. I wouldn't expect that. There is a negative relationship between optimism and escape avoidance. So the more optimistic you are, the less you will engage in escape avoidance. And then let's look at these nice active coping skills. And when we look at optimism, we see that optimism is negatively related to perceived stress, as we saw from the other correlation matrices. But in terms of planful problem solving, you can see that there's a positive relationship with optimism, a positive relationship with positive reappraisal, and but no statistically significant it's not statistically significant between optimism and confrontive coping. Now you see in the last one I was looking at this row, and in this one I'm looking at this row, but they're the same row. See, this is optimism going down, this is optimism going across. So you could interpret either one. And then finally, for hypothesis 3, people who report higher stress are more likely to report more physical symptoms and being bothered by these symptoms. This is the crux of health psychology, right? We have been reading a lot about stress and how it impacts the body, how better coping can buffer against this effect. So we want to see in our sample, is that existing? So do people with higher perceived stress, with more stress going on in their lives, and then I am looking at these passive ways of coping, are those related to poor health outcomes? And they absolutely are. So when we look at the physical symptom checklist, people who report more physical symptoms, more ailments, they are more likely to report higher perceived stress. They are more likely to identify more stressors in their lives, and this magnitude of a correlation is pretty impressive for psychology, because we have so many other variables that could be explaining it. So that shows there is definitely something going on. In terms of ways of coping, people who use more escape avoidance, who use more accepting responsibility, these passive ways of coping, they are related to poor health outcomes. Okay, so that provides you everything that you need. Now you will find a PowerPoint on Canvas, and I have made this much more user-friendly so that you can go through and look at the participants, you can look at the hypotheses, you can listen to this audio, but then I also have provided some information in these boxes. They're color-coded so you can see where it's significant. So you can feel free to use the SPS output that I'm providing, but you also can use this little cheat sheet to make things a little bit simpler. So good luck on your write-up. We are really interested to seeing how you draw in information from the different learning tools and also from your textbook to explain why some of these hypotheses came out as a